Questions?
It's supposed to be June. She has to focus on why she's
Now tomorrow, I have money for Anna.
Hello, hello. This is on. John. Check it.
I read that. In fact, I got it myself.
I don't want to repeat today's effort.
Just waiting for our guest speaker to get mic'd up, as they say these days. Can you hear me? Fine. I'll apologise in advance. I have one of those awful colds that are going around, and if I start a paroxysm of coughing, I'm not going to die. Just ignore me. I'll continue. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Australian Human Rights Commission for our Rights Talk, which today is delivered by a most distinguished Australian, Fred Chaney. I have to say it is a real pleasure to introduce Fred to you this afternoon, a pleasure on many levels. First of all, of course, he is our Senior Australian of the Year. And as Age Discrimination Commissioner, I was totally excited when I saw that this decision had been made, because I think nobody demonstrates better the capacity of people to continue to contribute to the community, to bring their wisdom and experience and dedication to important things in our community as they advance through life, than Fred does. So that was a very important decision, I think, and the signal it gives to senior Australians is a very strong and positive one. But of course, I'm also very pleased and honoured to introduce Fred, because I'm very familiar with his long and distinguished record of service to the Australian people, particularly in his years in the Federal Parliament, where Fred, from 1974 to 1990, was in the Australian Senate, representing Western Australia, his home state, and then he served as a member of the Western Australian House of Representatives seat until 1993. Now, Fred entered the Senate in 1974. I entered the Senate in 1975, on the opposite side of the chamber, of course. So we've known each other since that time, and I like to say that Fred is one of those people who gives politics a good name. And I'm always grateful for such manifestations of the decency and integrity and capability of people who come and serve our Parliament for a period of time. The very interesting thing about Fred is that once his parliamentary phase was over, he continued to work on the issues that had been of most importance to him, and dare I say it, to Australians, and that concerns the well-being of Indigenous Australians. He had been Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, which was most fitting because as a young lawyer in Western Australia he'd been very involved in Aboriginal rights and so forth, but when he left the Parliament he did not leave Aboriginal Affairs. He has chaired and served on the boards of many important Aboriginal organisations, including the Native Title Tribunal, many others, and he has been, I think, one of the leaders, one of the non-Indigenous leaders in the move towards reconciliation between white and black Australians, and now, of course, is playing an active leadership role in the move towards having Indigenous people recognised in our Constitution. I could tell you about the many, many boards and committees and foundations he has dedicated himself to with good effect, but I think a lot of you probably know that, which is why you're here today in such big numbers, but I think it's extremely important that here at the Australian Human Rights Commission we have somebody like Fred, who has been, of course, a supporter in human rights from various perspectives, who continues to be, and who has made the kind of contribution to Australia that deserves every accolade that has been ever given to him, including, as I said, the most recent one of Senior Australian of the Year. So you're all welcome. Some of our other Commissioner colleagues are with us. Commissioner Broderick, Commissioner Wilson, our newest Commissioner, and Gillian Triggs, our President, is overseas at the moment, but it gives you her words of welcome too. So thank you very much for coming. I'm going to invite Fred to speak about issues closest to his heart, on which he has made a massive contribution, and then when Fred's finished his address, there'll be the opportunity for people to ask questions or make comments. So Fred, please address our meeting.
Thank you, Susan, for a very generous introduction. I don't like to turn life into a competition, but you're all probably feeling very sympathetic to Susan because we're cold, but I can tell you there's something much more serious than that. I've got a man cold. That seems to be all I've got. Oh no, sorry. I was in some doubts that I'd be able to speak at all to you, so these are meant to ease your discomfort if I'm overcome by paroxysms of coughing. Can I start by paying my respects to the traditional owners, who are, I think, the Eora people, the Gadigal Nation, and can I say that there is, of course, a risk in these things that they become matters of rote and seen as simply with correctness, a nice thing to do, but doesn't mean anything. And I must say that as a West Australian who, as Susan would know, because she had the portfolio in opposition, Aboriginal Affairs, I think it was Susan, Western Australia, like Queensland, has not always been the easiest area in which, or the easiest part of Australia for Aboriginal people. Partly because they came a little bit late in the game, and so they had some of the more brutal things to do rather later in history, and in the more closely settled and earlier settled parts of Australia. But nothing has transformed the scene in Western Australia more than the Mabo case. And whereas up to Mabo in Western Australia, the Aboriginal people were essentially mendicants, seeking to come to the table as people who were asking for favour from the government. And of course, our record was under the 1905 Act, Aboriginal people were essentially ownership, they were, their whole lives were controlled and governed by bureaucrats. Suddenly, post-Mabo, they came to the table as stakeholders. So the West Australian Parliament has passed an Act of Parliament acknowledging the 37,000 Noongar people as the original owners of the Southwest. There's a major land negotiation between the Conservative government, started by the Labor government, the previous government, continued by this government, for a land settlement. And Western Australia is dotted by high order Labor title outcomes and by agreements which carry hundreds of millions of dollars of rewards. And the great mining companies, with which I used to have the most terrible squibs, are now very close allies, so that Rio Tinto and BHP funded the work that the foundation I helped set up, and work that the kids have done for the last 12, 15 years. And in so many ways, they're actually superior to government in the way they work with Aboriginal communities and effectiveness. So I guess my point to an audience which probably has a pretty strong interest in human rights, I would say that if you have some rights which enable you to come to the table as a stakeholder, it's a very different thing than coming to the table begging for some kindness of justice. And it is one of the nice things about Australia in 2014, one of the many nice things about this great country, that that power balance has shifted in a way which I think is helpful in terms of getting longer term successful outcomes in terms of our relationships and the visible and material circumstances of Aboriginal people. At the beginning of the year, when I got this unexpected and somewhat crushing honour to be Senior Australian of the Year, quite crushing because I had never looked in the mirror for some time. And I really was under the illusion that I was quite a youthful person, still quite vigorous, capable of contributing to Australia. And suddenly there I was, branded forever, an old chap. And I said to the commissioners who I met before lunch that there was almost a sense of resentment in me that I was brought to this terrible position. Until the young West Australian Year spoke before me. Young doctor working at Derby, Dr. Moxmere. He gave the most wonderful speech about what he was currently doing. I suddenly felt terribly old. I got up and said there's a very big difference between 25 and 72. So I now rather reluctantly accept this title as being old. But I started the year by saying, in the presence of the Prime Minister, that this was the most hopeful period of my life. And I really thought I'd start off with something by justifying that, why it should be, why I should think this is the most hopeful period of my life. And I'm talking about Aboriginal advancement, Aboriginal recognition, and where I think it's getting to. I want to say something about what I think are the risks, the difficulties, and how we might judge how well we handled 2014. And I'd like to finish off then by saying something about what you, readers and audience, might do. When I started out as a school student and then as a university student, taking interest in Aboriginal people, Australia was a foreign country compared to where it is now. if you go to the report of the Constitutional Recognition Group, you'll find quotations from our first and our second Prime Ministers, make it absolutely clear that Australia was a place which was based on being a white Australia. Within a few generations, there would be no vestige of colour. And after all, that was based on clear statements in the convention debates and in Parliament, the first Parliament, there could be no question of equality between white people and blacks. In a sense, those attitudes ran quite deeply into us as a country. So that when I met my first Aboriginal person in the 50s, I was puzzled by the fact that she didn't seem quite fit into what I understood the Australian scene to be. And then went to university and found that Aboriginal people were largely denied to vote, not totally, but largely denied to vote. We all know we're not counted in the census. In Western Australia, still were often confined to reserves, largely excluded from education, although missionaries, much criticised missionaries, certainly produced some very well-educated Aboriginal people, but the normal government system did very little. And we really had a form of de facto segregation. As a student, I went around all the reserves in southwest Western Australia and I saw people living in tin sheds, fundamentally excluded and, in my view, abused. And that was the Australia to fair go, the Australia which in so many ways was a brilliant example of democracy and fairness. And so we saw things happen. In 1961, the Parliament took unto itself, after a parliamentary committee inquiry, to which my Liberal Club made a submission, to grant voting rights generally for Aboriginal people. Wow, it took 61 years of federation to do it. 67 referendum, of course, the most brilliant success, where the most objectionable racist provisions of the Constitution were removed, not all of them, but the most obvious ones, and the Commonwealth was given the power to legislate. Then, of course, we move on to the more difficult area of land rights, bitterly contested, but eventually granted in most states, knocked off by the mining industry, and I have to say, by a couple of Labor governments in Western Australia. I remember saying to Susan, or I certainly said to the First Minister, you will never grant national land rights, it's too hard, and they didn't. And the battle then went back to the courts, and of course the Mabo case resulted, and there have been this extraordinary shift, as I said, in the power balance. And now I read that this year another 3 Aboriginal students are going off as postgraduates to Oxford, 7 there last year, 140 Aboriginal doctors. And although you can say, correctly say, there's still a lot which is horrific and wrong, there's been so much good that's been achieved, and so much good change, and I think we've got to stop and celebrate that, and in particular I implore Aboriginal people to celebrate the victories that their parents and grandparents have achieved, because if you don't think that you're getting anywhere, why would you keep trying? You've got to be very careful about only focusing on the very real problems of diminished, lesser life expectancy, worse employment, worse health, those things, less employment. These things are truths which we need to face up to, but we shouldn't shroud the fact that we are making progress, because otherwise people say, well, we spent all this money, and what have we achieved? Now, what about 2014? Well, here's the good stuff. I think when I started out in this business as a student, Aboriginal people would have been justified in saying that every hand is against us. I mean, people were pretty unfriendly, pretty unhelpful, and dismissive totally of their rights. I mean, we were clearing 1 million acres of land a year in Western Australia at that time. 1 million acres a year, you know, we didn't think at all that we were clearing people's livelihoods and their land and their country, just bundling them off whenever they were in the way. That was the way it worked. But now, if you look around the Australian community, there are what, 500 plus corporations and organisations with reconciliation action plans, all based on attempt to have respectful working relationships with Aboriginal people, drawn up in conjunction with Aboriginal people. You've got countless numbers of individual and group initiatives. I would say every day of my life, I'm approached by people who say, this is what I'm doing. I think we could do more. I think we can improve it. I mean, it is an amazing scene in Australia, how many allies the Aboriginal people have. It's a really terrific change. And then you've got government. Well, this is probably a bad time to be talking about government in circumstances. The budget, I understand all that. But if you want to understand that, you shouldn't actually see this through a party political prism. And to show that, I invite you to go back and look at Julia Gillard's last two reports on closing the gap. The Prime Minister is statutorily required to address the Parliament on closing the gap. Julia Gillard did that. And as we all know, she reported a painfully slow process, progress. Something I want to talk about. And what was Tony Abbott's response? I think most of you expect to get up and rip the throat out. I would have got up and said something like this, I haven't got a precise quotation. Prime Minister, if I was in your shoes, I would be reporting on these same things. And he paid tribute to Paul Keating for the Redfern speech. He paid tribute to Rudd for that magnificent apology, the high point of Rudd's Prime Ministership, in my view. It was not a partisan speech in the tone of current politics, then and now. It's a speech accepting that this is something which is for all of us that we've got to deal with. And the Prime Minister has pronounced himself the Prime Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. He has a Minister in Cabinet for Aboriginal Affairs, Indigenous Affairs, I'm sorry. He'd be able to testify that this is unprecedented. The Prime Minister adopting this responsibility. That is a Parliamentary Secretary with a lot of experience, Alan Tudge, assisting in Aboriginal Affairs. He's taken some 1,700, I think, public servants in the Prime Minister's Fund, which I think is a pretty strange thing to do administratively. But you have to take it as an earnest of a determination to actually drive change. Because it's only the Prime Minister's Department and the Treasury that really has the authority of the whole of government. And these are whole of government issues. So I guess what I'm saying is that along with the Australian community, which is absolutely vital in all of this, government and opposition and Greens, all of them, are showing an extraordinarily unusual degree of unity. This is something which has to be dealt with. And who is Australian of the Year? Adam Goodes. The Australian runs its own competitive Australian of the Year. They nominated 5 Australians at the same time, 4 of them Aboriginal people. You want an indication that the public mood is that this is something we've got to deal with. I think all of these are indicators that this is right. Susan's been in the business, I've been in the business, I carry my share of the blame for failure. I don't say that it's all failure, of course I don't. But it's not the progress I would have hoped, and that so many has hoped for. And yet I think we now know what works and what doesn't. I want to just quote a couple of things from self-assessments by government sectors about what works and what doesn't, what's required for success. And perhaps before I do that, I should say one more thing about the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth has taken 150 programs related to Aboriginal Affairs and dumped them into a single department and said we're going to reduce that to 5 streams of programs, and we're going to administer these programs in a flexible way with funding being available across the government. So that's one of the present things. Here's what Gary Banks, the chairman of the Productivity Commission, who's just left that job, signed off on successively in looking at government progress or lack of progress in Indigenous affairs. It's the Steering Committee for the Review of Government Service Provisions. I'm going to actually read what they say. It observes the lack of these factors contribute to program failures. These are the things that are required for success. Cooperative approaches between Indigenous people and government, often with the non-profit and private sectors as well. Community involvement in program design and decision making, a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach. Good governance at organisation and community, and I interpolate importantly, at government levels, and ongoing government support, including human, financial and physical resources. Now my comment on that is that I would say, I don't think anyone knows anything about this business. would actually quarrel with that analysis. You've got to stop doing things to Aboriginal people, you've got to do things with Aboriginal people. Is the second point, basically. But I think it would be fair to say that no one would claim those conditions apply at any time. I don't have time to do a complete analysis of that, but let me say that take the thing that I think is most important, that Aboriginal people themselves must be involved in these things. That, in the words of this, that there must be community involvement in program design and decision making. Bottom up rather than a top-down approach seldom applies in practice. It's said to apply, but it can't apply because government timetables are incompatible with the timetables of the Aboriginal communities. I'm working with people in the Central Desert at the moment, and they are in the enthusiasm of a new government, and the legitimate enthusiasm of a new government to really change things quickly, facing the prospect of very rapid change. For them to participate in a bottom-up design of how these things work takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to talk these things through the community, for them to really come to a point where, yes, this is how we want to do it, this is what we want to do, and this is how we do it. So, successive governments, I'm not taking any sides here. I've not been a member of a political party for the best part of 15 years. This is not a party political thing. This is a thing where there are real issues and difficulties, and we should analyse them and be non-political about this, non-partisan about it, because that's not the politics, it's not the good intentions. I think it was said I was going to talk about the road to hell. This is the road to hell for a lot of people, because there have been so many good intentions, so many limited outcomes. What is required is a dramatic difference in the way government goes about its business. Now, again, I have to say there's been an enormous amount of good faith work done by people, and if I can switch attention from politicians to bureaucrats, one of my heroes is Peter Shergoff, head of the Prime Minister's Department under John Howard, but before that, head of ASIC, I think at the time of your government, Susan, and in my view, a really fine Australian who has the good of this country at his heart. He tried to drive a coordinated whole-of-government approach to Aboriginal affairs. We had things called the COAG trials. Ministers were involved, public service heads were involved, public service heads met in Canberra, ministers and public servant heads were made responsible for regions. It was a massive effort, and it produced a vast amount of bureaucratic effort and paper. Peter's self-assessment of that is that we didn't achieve the results we wanted. And we didn't because we didn't meet those conditions. But the departments themselves looked at this and said, what do you need to get whole of government to work? And this is what they said. You need substantial initial cross-agency and stakeholder agreement about the broad purpose. In other words, what the departments are trying to do has to match what the Aboriginal people want to have. That's the same point as the others make. You've got to have an outcomes-based budget framework to pool resources and to have appropriate accountability programs. All that sounds like garbage, doesn't it? But that's actually completely correct. Or it sounds like gobbledygook, I mean, not garbage. You have to have lead agency staff empowered with sufficient authority to manage whole of government settings and lead the engagement of stakeholders. You have to empower the managers to engage with relevant individuals and interests, to ensure the individuals engaged in these roles have the appropriate networking, collaboration, and entrepreneurial skills. I agree with all that. I think the public servants have accurately set out what is required, and I would say that those conditions have never applied. And they still don't apply. The beauty of the last budget is that they would permit that to happen. What I would say about the announcements of the last week, and I know all the attention's been on the aged and the young and the pensioners and all the stuff that everybody naturally feels very strongly about. In this vital area, if you look at the framework that's been announced, we would have to say it would permit sort of conditions for success to be in place. Now, that's why I'm hopeful. And what are the obstacles? Well, in my view, there are a couple of obstacles, and I know the government is addressing these, but will it address them successfully? We don't know yet. One of the obstacles is that the sort of qualities of management that the public service heads talked about are not present in the public service. And no one is trained to do this very difficult work. You know, in this well-meaning audience, if you were thrown into the field and told to do it, then unless you have an unusual skill set, you do just as badly as everyone else has done. We used to train people at the School of Pacific Administration under people like Stanner, Pastor Stanner, Charles Rowley. We had a really high-class training 30, 40 years ago. It's gone. And so one of the things that the question that has to be asked is, will there be a skill set that matches the rhetoric and the framework that's been outlined? And the second thing is, will there be accountabilities for public servants, which mean that they will act in a different way? I work a lot with public servants, and I'm devoted to public servants. I still work with people who were in my department 35 years ago. So I embrace public servants as good Australians who try to do the right thing. The system under which they work is one where they're accountable to the centre, they're accountable to the department guidelines, they're accountable to the estimates committees, corruption commissions. Rule of law applies, this is a democracy. They're required to act according to their instructions and according to the law. So unless you change the rules and the framework in which they work, their behaviour will remain the same. Unless they are trained to behave differently, their behaviour will remain the same. I want to scandalise those of you who have a more left persuasion by saying that mining companies have copped on to do this better than government in most cases. ATSIC did it better. Sadly, the ATSIC board was a problem, but the ATSIC regional councils in many cases worked in the way that those formulations describe. So, will they do it? Well, again, an optimistic note. There's a group of 8 regions led by Aboriginal people who are saying we want to work differently. It's called the Empowered Communities Proposal. Noel Pearson is the most publicly known of these, but there's some other amazing Aboriginal people like Ian Truss from East Kimberley. They are saying we want to be at the table as equals with government. We embrace the notion of peaceful communities, of kids going to school, of people who work. We're going to work with government on that, and we want to be equally at the table in the design and management of programs. And the government, I know, is working on that. And it's got independent people of government working on how to make that work. So all I can say to you is that I remain of the view that this is a year where so many of the factors are good, where the system is open to really great possibilities, and where we just have to hope, and in my case, do everything humanly possible to assist government to get to the point where it actually conforms to those basic rules of how to make this happen, how to make it work. Aboriginal leadership, Aboriginal involvement is absolutely the core of this. The most the rest of us can hope to do is to be respectful partners in this enterprise, and being a typical old black male, I know how easy it is to just want to boss people around. I can tell you, I know it doesn't work. Like a working partnership is totally ineffectual. I've been at this now for 50 years, not full time. I've been a lawyer, I've been a politician, I've done lots of different things. But this has been the golden thread of my life. And some people would say, and do say to me, how do you stick it out? Because there's so much to learn. My answer is that there is so much good that is happening. A little example, a tiny example of a foundation I'm part of, the Polyfarmer Foundation, which has currently about 1,100 kids in about 30 state schools, and we're regularly getting those kids through year 12, and roughly a third of them go to university, a third go into apprenticeships, and a third go into good employment. I think I would regard the last 50 years as justified. We only have one of those kids. We haven't got 1,000. And that's what this is about. This is about, one by one, Aboriginal people getting the dignified place in Australia to which they're entitled. It's also about recognising that Aboriginal people have a multi-layered place in this country. They are full citizens of Australia, fully entitled to what Australia has to offer. They're also members of Aboriginal First Nations, and I believe, and this is up to them, but I believe what will happen is they will continue to be First Nations people. They will continue to act and think collectively as well as individual Australians. And that's a hard thing for a lot of us to come to grips with. That, yeah, we are all equal as Australians, but our First Nations have a particular and peculiar place which, as collectives, not as individuals, gives them a different place in Australian geography and society. And I think that's working its way through, in part, the action of, say, a Conservative government in Western Australia. And I say that because the Conservatives in Western Australia have often been absolutely beastly, absolutely dreadful. But currently, they are legislators to recognise people's traditional owners of the place for most Western Australia, with the southwest. Constitutional recognition is part of the story, part of this journey. Exclusion, voting rights, then inclusion, and a neutral constitution to one which is a constitution which actually incorporates them and acknowledges their place in Australia. And I can't stress too much. People say, what good will constitutional change be? Well, it's simply another step in giving Aboriginal people a truly dignified and acknowledged place in Australia. One of the lawyers I most admire in Australia is a man called Hal Wood, who I think at the age of 89 was working with Ramallah on the problem between Palestinians and Jews. I think shows a certain older Australian fortitude, actually. But Hal was a lawyer, Royal Commissioner, a judge. He founded the law school at the University of New South Wales. He has the mind I would love to have. He started off, as I did actually, done a lot of work in New Zealand, and he, in the Hal Wood lecture, which was started in his honour, which he gave, he talked about one of his early experiences, which reflected my own sense, my own lifetime, and my time in the beginning, my time with Aboriginal people. He said, I was 24, and men of my age would spend hours each evening talking about time in the bush and in yarning in my hut. They told me the humiliating racism they had suffered at the hands of whites, who administrators, planters, or missionaries were always the masters, and they the boys. We got close, but they could not bring themselves to sit down and eat with me. One tribe was unable to eat. I asked him why, and he confidently said with great bitterness, you master, you boy. I learnt the power of humiliation, its ubiquitous and corrosive effect, where one group of people believe they are superior to another. Well, that captures my life experience of dealing with Aboriginal people. They are so used to being treated with contempt, even silent contempt. You can sniff disrespect. I walk into this audience, I know I'm regarded as a very next-level politician, Yahoo, you can smell that. You know, I mean it. I've been in plenty of unfriendly audiences, and you know it. The reason I think I've got on with Aboriginal people is that they know I respect them. So they forgive my mistakes, my failings, my blundering. Of course I do these things, I can understand it. But what I'm saying to you is that this issue of race remains an important part of this story. I'm really grateful to Adam Goods, the Australian of the Year, for relicensing the discussion about racism in the country. It had gone off the public agenda because you, the Australian people, were so resentful whenever it was raised. We all have to take our responsibility for who we are as people, and I can tell you, nothing closed the minds and ears of people quicker than suggesting there might be a problem with racism in our community. And this may, in that sense, be an unusual audience. But I think that when somebody like Adam, who is not known for his theorising, but for his amazing 17-year athletic career, stands up and says, when you hear about racism, don't let it just pass over your shoulder, have a conversation about it. I think that's a really great thing that happened in 2014. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's another reason why I feel pretty good about this year. Not foolishly optimistic, but we have the raw material for closing the gap much more quickly than we once thought. The last thing I thought I'd mention, we forgot, was this. What can I do? You know, I get so many people saying, what can I do? Well, I've never found it difficult to find something to do, actually. And I would really say to all of you that this is a great national endeavour where a lot of your fellow Australians are joining in, and there are a lot of levels at which you can. Ultimately, you'll all be called upon, I think, to vote on the constitutional change, and you'll be able to help in that. In the interim, you can go to the website, recognise, and join up as a supporter. Small thing to do, but another voice and get government worth pursuing. There are so many people out there doing good stuff that if you want to find someone to support, you might be doing it. You know, there are opportunities to mentor students, to tutor students. There are a whole lot of initiatives. I hear them every day. And there's no excuse for any Australian who says, well, I'd love to help, but I just nothing I can do. That is, when I use the word, I said to my mother, that's bullshit. There is always something that you can do. If you can't think of anything else, send Reconciliation Australia a check. You need the money. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've been very patient. I guess what I'm going to leave you with this sense is that Australia is on a very positive journey here. It's a lot slower than we would like, but it's a real perceptible movement towards the sort of decency that we should have as a country. It extends not just to some of the wars. And I think that there is an opportunity for us to have a relationship with our First Nations which is dignified, acknowledges their place in our history and our present. I think there are opportunities to ensure that their material deprivation is reduced, if not removed. But it requires us to be a big enough country to accept that there can be in our midst people who remain different, have an identity of their own, sometimes act as a collective. I personally embrace all that.
To thank Fred on behalf of all of us, I would like to invite any questions or comments from our most attentive audience. Yes, this will bring the microphone. It's all recorded for posterity.
Thank you. I'm Professor Jenny Onyx from UTS, but also a member of the Older Women's Network, and have recently, somewhat to my horror, discovered a re-emergence of the stolen generation happening right here in New South Wales. It's another example of the public thought it had been fixed following the apology, and we didn't want to talk about it anymore. Apparently there are now more children being taken, removed, against the family's will than ever was the case, and the majority of these are Aboriginal children, than ever was the case in the stolen generation period. It is a wicked problem. There are good reasons why the children are being removed. It's the case of the bureaucracy applying their rules quite rigidly. It's moving now to apparent forced adoptions, because the market forces suggest there's a large demand for children that are no longer available, and here's a ready market. The point being that this move is tearing already troubled communities apart. We at the Older Women's Network are trying to work with the grandmothers, the Indigenous grandmothers, against removals. So there is an attempt in more positive terms to build a positive response. But it's very, very difficult. I feel both hopeful but despairing that a problem we thought was fixed is re-emerging worse than ever. Your comments, please.
I would try not to be glib in this comment, because I think it's a very multifaceted and difficult issue. As a young lawyer, I came across child removal, or attempted child removal, purely race-based. And it was easy, relatively easy, I found, to resist that. But I think it's probably fair to say that removals now are substantially welfare-based, and they rise out of a complex of factors, including the fact that police pick up children, for example, and there's nowhere they can take into custody. So there is no responsibility. breakdown of social norms are very real problems. They're not fictitious problems, they're real problems. And there are children at risk, and I would hate to have the job of trying to sort out the issues that you're talking about, but my response would be this: that you do have to have, as in all of these things, a whole government response because of the number of interrelated factors. In my state of Western Australia, because many of the troubles and tenancies involve Aboriginal people, and I can tell you some bad stories about that. There's been a tightening up of the tenancy rules, and that's substantially impacting on Aboriginal people, and that is rendering people homeless, adding to possibly child neglect. And I just mentioned that as one factor, which, if you're going to deal with this holistically, requires a response across a great range of areas. The Commissioner of Police in Western Australia, to whom I have my great respect, is continually saying to the public, we are locking up Aboriginal people at 18 times the rate of the general community. I mean, it's a disgrace. It's heartbreaking. This is not a police problem. This is a social, whole of society problem. I think he's right. So, as I say, I don't want to be glib because I think the complexities facing a child protection officer. When a child, I hear children who are successively taken back to their environment, find out again in deep material, physical trouble. I think the task is dreadful, but the task is only doable if you are actually providing social supports to dysfunction. Policemen in West Australia, who's quite senior secondly, we've just got 500 new police. Probably the most effective way to reduce crime rates, and this is a related issue, because a lot of the criminals are children who are simply out of control, no further supervision, so on, would be to assign one policeman to a family. Not to punish the family, but to work with the family. That would do more to reduce the crime rate than anything else we might do. And I think that's actually happening in Australia. They're assigning specific people, specific families, not to punish them, to work with them. So, can I just say that the stolen generation issue was one of the things which locked me into my engagement in this area. I've written about and talked about the case that I did as a lawyer. Only a few, I have to say, but they were horrifying. And to see the re-emergence, as you say, of a lost generation, it's called a lost generation, is a great tragedy. But you will not solve it by policing, you will not solve it by child protection. They are very important elements of it, but you have housing and other general support and welfare issues to deal with if you're going to get on top of it. But I personally would always say that the welfare of the child, in the end, is the ultimate test. And if you have to remove a child because there's no other course, then I would prefer to see it. On the adoption point, and I should be clear, I regarded True Gard as a friend. I went to her wedding. I knew her as a journalist. She's a very good person. But I've seen this talk about adoption, and of course, think about it. As I understand it, the problem is that the fostering system leads to many children going from hand to hand. In some of those hands, they're abused. And there are people who want to take this on as a long-term thing. I think, again, the judgments have become extremely difficult. There are 3 adopted children in my broader family, and I'm aware of how traumatic that must have been for mothers. Some of them have written about that. These are very complex and difficult issues, but I think that when I read of a child and 20 sets of foster parents in a relatively short period of time, I do think that child is probably stuck. So, as I say, I'm trying not to be glib. I'm saying I think it's very complicated, and I could only say that you need a serious whole of government response to this sort of thing.
Hi, my name is Chandran. I'm just an ordinary Australian. You did say at the beginning that you don't accept that you are old, but I have to say we don't. We find you someone with a very young mind and young heart. So very good. So, and anyway, now to my question. Now my question is a sort of general in nature, not something you specifically said. Why do you think Australia has done not as well as, say, New Zealand or Canada when it comes to closing the gap, as it were, with their indigenous people. I'm using Canada and Australia because we have cultural similarities, so comparison may not be out of place. So if you can throw some light on that, maybe that will tell us something about what we are doing wrong.
Sure, that's a very good question. I won't debate you about the old thing. What I can say is that I had to tell him that I was a better man 20 years ago than I am. Look, it's inevitable. You do get older, and I think you have to accept that and work on it. But to return to your question, New Zealand has had a number of advantages over Australia, and I agree with you, they've done better. They've got a single language. We had hunting. They had a treaty. However little that treaty meant and how little it was honoured, it acknowledged the polity, the existence of the people as against individual Maoris. And the same thing in Canada. They've got a history of treaties. And for people who say that constitutional recognition doesn't matter, treaties and things, they don't matter, I say that's wrong. Those countries which have gone down the path of recognition, treaty recognition, language recognition, have done better on the social and economic and gender front than we've done. So I think we have things to learn, but it is a more complex situation. I mean, I know no Aboriginal language after working with Aboriginal for 50 years because there's so many of the damn things. So I know the odd Noongar word and the other one. But I'm ashamed to say, when I go to an Aboriginal community, I have to talk in English because they talk English, all happen to. So, yeah, it's a different country, different geography, different history. But I would say the lessons I draw is that formal recognition of peoples as people is an important plus in the countries you mentioned. And that gives those native peoples a more dignified and therefore more self-assured place in the country.
Thanks. Next question. Hello, hi, I'm Tara. I'm from SBS and NITV News. I just would like to know your opinion on the federal budget and how you think the consolidation of 150 Indigenous programs into 5 and the $7 Medicare co-payments, how is that going to close the gap on Indigenous disadvantage?
Well, I did try and address that, but let me go back. I did try and address it. Yeah. I mean, I think that I don't want to get into a discussion about whether shaving of some of the programs is going to make a big difference. I don't know. It may. I think what I said in response to an interview this morning, so I may have transposed that into today's address, was that it's always a worry when funding is reduced for programs in these areas. But I would suspend judgment because I think the notion of bringing 150 programs into 5 streams and running those streams in a way which is holistic, regional, engaged with the Aboriginal people, may well mean we do a lot better. Now, whether the government has the capacity to carry that through to fruition is something on which I suspend judgment. I'm not here as a spokesperson for the government, I can assure you. But what I can say is that I think on the tests that I read out, you can directly relate many of those administrative changes to those conditions which public servants and external observers have said these are the preconditions for success. Those preconditions can be better met under these new arrangements. The doubt I've raised is whether the skills that are currently available in the bureaucracy to actually implement in the manner that it needs to be implemented. We don't know. And whether the instructions for public servants will give them the authority to behave in a different way, to manage for outcomes, to be accountable for using money and resources to, for example, pursue better health, pursue more peaceful community, pursue more education. These are iterative processes. So I can tell you what it's like working with mining companies. I'm sorry, I want to finish on this point. It's really important. We've been working in the Pilbara in schools which have never graduated Aboriginal students. And now we're graduating them regularly through year 12, as I said, getting them into university or trades and whatever. The interesting thing about working with the mining companies is that BHP have been supporting our work in Port Hedland. They independently of us went off and said, we're going to check this out. But they followed what had happened to our students. Where do they live? What's their education? What's their employment? What's their income? They came to us and said, here's the results, because they were fantastic results. They said, we'll double the project. Then they and Rio both said to us, look, we're happy with the outcomes here, we're happy with the results, but we're not getting enough maths and science strength. The Pilbara, having people with maths and science skills is really important if they're going to get into high-level jobs. So let's go down to the primary schools and start maths and science. So they have what I call an iterative approach to doing things. You manage for outcomes. You learn on the job. You don't say, follow this book of rules. You say, we want kids to finish year 12. Manage as many of the factors as you can to get through that point. It's a great way of working. And if public servants are authorised to behave like that, they will. They need the legal authority. They need the financial authority. They must be accountable, but they mustn't be manacled to a rigid way of working. So that's the big question mark.
Question up the back there. This will be our last formal question, then we'll have the opportunity.
I'm sorry to be so lengthy in my answers, but
yes,
none of them are simple propositions. I'm sorry.
No, and Fred, Chris Andrew from Angus and I've actually managed 6 of the RJCP regions. And you've almost answered the question I was going to ask you in terms of the learnings from the mining companies and their ability to, I guess, measure that investment. So they're able to look at a return on investment from what they're investing into communities, and their outcomes are driven by being able to measure that. And they run assets that take 30 years to come out of the ground and pay off. And it's really that framework in terms of how to apply a similar sort of measurement framework into a government. So you've talked about skills of authorities, but do you feel that the bureaucracy is open from a whole of government approach to set in place a measurement framework that takes into a lot of the multifaceted natures of these cause and effects that you've talked about, setting up frameworks for measurements across these different departments to be able to properly capture the social, economic and environmental outcomes?
Well, I agree with you that measurement is vital, because you're not measuring what you're doing, you're getting it. That's right. I think it actually goes beyond measurement. Measurement is one of the tools you use. Again, I think I've said this earlier today, but let me repeat it. Take a simple thing like an iron ore mine. It involves probably, in the case of those big miners, digging up different ore from perhaps 5 or 6 different mines with different metallurgical and other characteristics. There are metallurgical issues, there are geological issues, there are transport issues, human resources issues, price issues, there are interest rate issues, exchange rate issues. And these companies fundamentally have got a simple thing. They'll put iron ore onto a ship at a price which is greater than what it costs to manage all of those factors to achieve a profit. And so they're used to managing a great complex of factors. And they're not saying, for example, the railway people, here's a book of rules about the railway. For their economic people, here's a book of rules about that. For their geologists, they all actually have to, all of those knowledges and learnings and activities have to be drawn into a comprehensive working system which produces results. When they said about wanting to employ Aboriginal people, and Rio now has about 1,500. I think it's pretty close to that, maybe 12. When a West farmer says, we're going to get to Aboriginal employment, and Richard Goyder says, well, up to 2,000, from a standing start, but 2,000 now, our aim is 5. They will manage the complex of factors to achieve the outcome. Public servants are not given that real opportunity. You have to actually authorise them to manage project management, achieving, and you're not project managing on your own because all of the learnings are, you've got to do that in partnership with the Aboriginal people. So it's a complex thing. But public servants are used to being given a set of rules. The RJCP, the rules about RJCP are sitting on my desk. They're that thick. You're familiar with them?
Very much.
So these poor buggers get a set of rules which they can work through and tick off. This is an attempt to move to a different, more flexible, managed for outcomes approach. I think it's a huge challenge for the Australian public service, huge challenge for the Australian government. But I think that's what they're trying to do. And they've been assisted by some very good Aboriginal people, advocates, and I mentioned Old Pearson and Trust and others, who are really pushing this hard. So, will they get there? Well, ask me at the end of the year, and I'll give you a very honest.
Thanks, Fred. And Fred, I have to say, what you had to say to us today and the stories that you brought with it have surpassed even my high expectations of what we would experience by having you as our rights talker today. I think we'll all agree it's been a most informative and a most encouraging approach to what has been our most intractable set of challenges in dealing with our First Nations. And Fred, I think the fact that you could say you decided that this year in your life, despite the somewhat dubious honour as you see it of being the Senior Australian of the Year, this year is the most hopeful year of your life, is something I hope we could all be infected by and feel the same. And I really respond, and I'm sure we all did, to your reminding us that we have to celebrate what has been achieved. We have to respect the older Indigenous people, the grandparents, the older people who campaigned and rallied and did so much to create the circumstances where you have these absolutely wonderful numbers of Aboriginal kids finishing Year 12 in the Pilbara, going on to university, training to be doctors, lawyers, engineers, mining engineers, I hope, for Western Australia's economy. I mean, we do have to recognise that those things have happened, and they've happened because of the dedication and work over many, many years of many people, but no one has contributed more than Fred Chaney. So, Fred, thank you for reminding us of the positives, and please note, Fred did throw out a challenge to everyone here: do something yourself in terms of the movement towards constitutional recognition. He gave a few examples of things you might do. I'm sure there are others. So not only have you informed and inspired us, but you've given us a task to do, and I'm sure everyone will go off and do it. Please thank, ladies and gentlemen, our rights speaking guests. A little bit longer. We've got some afternoon tea down the back of the room, and there's an opportunity to have your discussions. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this wonderful event.
Extra rule. You can't have a grandmother too close living too close to the child in question who still has relations.